When you think of witchcraft in earlier centuries, you probably think of stereotypically wizened women huddled round cauldrons or casting curses. You probably wouldn't immediately think of royal witches. Yet within the space of a single century, there were 4 women in England's royal family that fell prey to witchcraft accusations. Whether they actually practiced witchcraft is unknown, and quite honestly, it's unlikely they did. Rather, the accusations served a political purpose for those around them. Now, this is an epic tale of quite lofty proportions, but we're going to have a look at the witchcraft part of these particular accusations in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with Listener Request Month, which obviously this is the last one of the month, but never mind. And this is going to be an episode all about royal witches, which was requested by Donna. Now, like I said in the introduction, this is a huge topic, and the 4 royal witches in question are Joan of Navarre, Eleanor Cobham, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, and Elizabeth Woodville. Now, this is, like I say, is a huge story, so if you do want the deep context and historical background to these 4 specific women, I highly recommend Gemma Holman's Royal Witches from Joan of Navarre to Elizabeth Woodville, and indeed this did actually provide a lot of the background information for the 4 witches I'm going to be having a look at. We will obviously also be taking a detour into Sophie Page and Owen Davies' work, but if you are interested in these women and you want to learn more, then that book will tell you everything that you need to know. But as I say, we're going to focus a lot more on the witchcraft part of the proceedings in this particular episode, because the book does delve into all the shenanigans and skullduggery and everything that was going on in the background. I'm interested more in the accusations themselves. But without any further ado, let's kick off with our first one, which is Joan of Navarre. Now, she was born in 1368 in Pamplona, Navarre, and she married her first husband, Duke of Brittany, in 1386. Now, Joan later married Henry IV of England in 1403, and it does seem like that was actually arranged between the pair of them because they actually quite liked each other, so that's quite cool. But because she was his second wife, she gained a huge dower from the king, and by all accounts, they also seem to have had quite a healthy marriage. Now, the fact that Henry had children by his late first wife meant that there wasn't really any pressure on Joan to produce an heir, so she could just enjoy being his wife, and as it was, she seemed to become the beloved stepmother of Henry V, who became king in 1413. So it is quite nice to see how well Joan did seem to get on with Henry IV's children. Now, in 1419, while Henry was away fighting his campaign in France, his government placed Joan under house arrest. Now, the government accused Joan of conspiring to kill Henry V using witchcraft, and these particular charges meant that the crown could seize her lands to fund Henry's campaign. Now, Joan never actually got the chance to answer the charges because the crown held her over the accusations, but no trial ever actually took place. And this meant that Parliament didn't have to pronounce her guilty, and then that would mean they would have to execute her, but they also didn't have to pronounce her innocent, because the minute they did that, they would also have to restore her lands and wealth. So instead, they kept her in relative comfort in a series of grand manors, where she received visitors and kept servants, and she also had quite a generous allowance as well. Now, it is difficult to know what Joan was supposed to have actually done, because there are no specific details of the witchcraft involved. And I think this is the thing with this accusation, it's so delightfully vague, and on purpose, because quite clearly there was no witchcraft, and they've just said there was because they wanted to get their hands on her money. Now, crucially, when Henry V was on his deathbed in 1422, he dropped all charges against Joan. She regained all of her property and wealth and returned to society a free woman, later to be buried beside Henry IV in Canterbury Cathedral in 1437. But that said, she did spend 3 years under house arrest purely so men could help themselves to her money. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's almost a sad story, because of the fact that she was at their whim. But at the same time, she quite clearly still had some powerful friends who would come to visit her. And obviously, why would you associate with an accused witch unless you knew she was innocent? And, lest you be accused yourself. But I think this is a really important case because it means that Parliament had learned just how powerful and useful a witchcraft accusation could actually be. There's very little else to say about Joan because that's literally all that happened. She was accused of witchcraft, held under house arrest for 3 years while they used her income to fund the campaign, and then when Henry was dying, decided he was going to do right by his stepmother and then returned everything. So it does just go to show how that particular accusation clearly had an ulterior motive. Then, of course, we move on to Eleanor Cobham, and she's quite interesting because she probably would have known Joan, and she was born in 1400, and she was the younger daughter of a knight from Surrey. Now, she managed to become the mistress of Humphrey, who was Henry V's brother, and therefore Joan of Navarre's stepson. And once his marriage to Jacqueline of Hainault was annulled, and again, Royal Witches as a book goes into why that was, Humphrey then promptly married Eleanor in 1428. Now, bear in mind, Humphrey was in direct line of succession, so this caused quite the scandal because she brought no title, no money, no lands to the marriage. She wasn't highborn or anything like that. She wasn't going to help anyone create an alliance with another country. She was just someone that it seemed that Humphrey had fallen in love with. And it does sound like a genuine love match, and the pair of them set about creating a somewhat mini court for themselves filled with artists and intellectuals. Now, unfortunately, the political skullduggery of the time again reared its ugly head, and Henry VI's favourite, so this is the son of Henry V, wanted to depose Humphrey because Humphrey had acted as Lord Protector while Henry VI was too young to rule, but then once he became old enough to take over the throne, Humphrey then was one of his advisors. But some of his favourites really didn't like Humphrey because they felt that he had too much influence and they wanted rid of him, which is a bit silly because Humphrey was actually quite popular with quite a lot of people. But obviously at the time you would get close to the king so that you could get stuff given to you and your family essentially. So they wanted to get rid of Humphrey, but this was no simple task, given his popularity with the people and his close relationship with Henry, Humphrey's nephew. So they looked back at the example set by Henry V and Joan of Navarre. So in 1441, they accused Eleanor of hiring an astrologer named Roger Bolingbroke to predict Henry VI's death, so that Humphrey could then use that knowledge for his own ends. I should point out, in this particular period, it was considered treason to predict the death of the king, and astrology in general could be a little bit of a dicey thing to practice because of the fact that if it was believed that you were looking into anything to do with the king, then it could be assumed that you were trying to find out when he would die, and as I say, that was treason. Now, they also accused her of hiring Marjorie Jordanmain, the so-called Witch of Eye, to help her in her nefarious plans. And in some of the cases, she was accused of trying to use necromancy, and they were trying to bring about the king's death using various magical means. And then obviously if this happened, then the throne would have passed to Humphrey. Now, Marjorie was actually basically a cunning woman, and it is quite interesting that she was even involved in the first place, because sorcery cases were relatively infrequent and didn't usually involve cunning folk. But obviously it seems like Marjorie had some kind of reputation and therefore was quite an easy target herself. Now, Eleanor must have been absolutely terrified by all of this, and the king's favourites produced figures that they claimed she'd used for her sorcery. Now, rather than refuting the accusations out of hand, because it did seem like they had some kind of evidence, Eleanor actually decided to play along up to a point. So she told them that yes, she had hired Marjorie, but it was to work love magic, not anything more nefarious. And Gemma Holman suggests that she may have actually hired Marjorie, but it was actually more likely to help her conceive a child, which is a reasonable assumption since Eleanor never had any children. Love magic wasn't illegal, although it wasn't well thought of, and I'll explain why in a minute, but Eleanor must have reasoned that admitting to a lesser charge would avoid the death penalty, and of course in some ways also consulting a cunning woman over something like wanting to get pregnant would also have been a little bit more understandable. But as it was, there were no actual specific secular laws against magic from the 12th century onwards, because magic was actually considered a matter to be dealt with by the church rather than the state. And to be fair, the activities of cunning folk were usually moral offences rather than heresy, where they were doing things like casting love magic or finding lost objects and healing and all that kind of thing. So unless they got involved in treason or murder, they were largely considered to perhaps be interfering with the natural order of things, but that was about it. But this helps to explain why love magic was such a problem, because it was essentially disruptive in a social sense. Now, Sophie Page notes that, and I quote, "A high proportion of the people tried in medieval courts for using erotic magic were women. Female sexual powers were considered more threatening than men's, particularly in relation to political and religious concerns over the stability of marriage, end quote. So given marriage was the way by which a man essentially secured his legacy, you can see why they were concerned about the validity of a marriage, because if it was suddenly decided that a marriage was invalid, your heirs could then be made illegitimate and cut off, and you would have nobody to leave anything to. Now, and again, as Page continues to note, medieval courts were rife with succession anxieties and intense competition between formal and informal sources of power, and it was not uncommon to use the services of an occult practitioner or accuse a rival of doing so to gain political advantage, end quote. So here we can see how you could either hire one of these people to do dirty things yourself, or you could accuse somebody else of having done it. And because of the fact that you do have people with competing claims to the throne and things like that, there's always this understanding that if somebody had a claim to the throne, it was almost their duty to try and steal it in some way. So you can see why accusing Eleanor of trying to do anything to get rid of the king to get Humphrey on the throne would almost be an understandable accusation at the time. Now, for Eleanor, her gamble worked, not for Marjorie. Now, the church might tolerate a first offence of magic or being a cunning woman, but the accused witch would be made to promise at that point that they were sorted out the first time that they would change their ways. If you were a repeat offender, it was clear that you hadn't changed your ways. So Marjorie was unfortunately executed for heresy, because it seems that she was something of a known witch, so clearly the authorities were aware of her. Now, Eleanor didn't escape unscathed either, and Henry's favourites claimed that her marriage to Humphrey was invalid because she had procured his affections through magic. And there's a lot of stuff that Holman explains in much more detail about the fact that one thing that the church held really dear was that a marriage couldn't be considered valid if one of the parties hadn't consented to it. So the idea was, if you use love magic to compel someone to marry you, they hadn't given their consent. And therefore, if Humphrey couldn't have consented to the marriage because he was under Eleanor's influence, it then meant that it wasn't a valid marriage anymore. So the church actually forcibly divorced Eleanor and Humphrey, and she lived out the rest of her life essentially as a penniless woman under house arrest, moved from castle to castle across England and Wales. Now, she never saw Humphrey again, and he ended up being embroiled in his own nonsense as well, but she actually died at Beaumaris Castle in Wales in 1452. Now, the second wife of John, Duke of Bedford, who was Humphrey's older brother, would have watched all of this unfold. She might even have known Eleanor well, we don't know. But she too would end up on the wrong end of a witchcraft accusation, but she would use what she'd learned from Eleanor's case to come out of it a little bit better. And she was Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Now, she was born in 1415, and her marriage to the Duke of Bedford in 1433 made a lot of sense, because if anything had happened to Henry VI before he produced an heir, the Duke, who was his uncle, would have then become king, because he was sort of in line before Humphrey was. But obviously the Duke of Bedford died before Humphrey, which is how Humphrey ends up in the line of succession. And I hope you're following this, because it does all get a little bit confusing. But anyway, so Jacquetta, who was already born of European royal blood, would have been queen had the Duke of Bedford ever made it to being king. But unfortunately, she was widowed following the death of John, Duke of Bedford in 1435. But Jacquetta then needed Henry VI's permission to remarry, because she was part of the royal family by this point, and marrying someone else with a claim to the throne could have caused problems. Now, Jacquetta doesn't really seem to be someone who did things by the rules quite a lot, and she certainly didn't marry anyone with a claim to the throne, but she did incur Henry VI's wrath by marrying in 1437 without his permission. And Henry VI does sound quite petty in quite a lot of ways, but given Jacquetta's second husband, Sir Richard Woodville, was a somewhat lowly knight, Henry VI would never have granted his permission in the first place, which explains why Richard and Jacquetta married in secret. Now, Richard's father was on the King's Council, and the Woodvilles were a rising family, but Jacquetta was essentially expected to marry higher. And while it was something of a scandal for Humphrey, this Prince of England, to marry Eleanor Cobham, who was just the daughter of a knight, to do it the other way around, where you've then got this woman of, like, essentially royal blood then marrying a knight, it just wasn't really the done thing. But either way, Jacquetta and Richard do sound like they had a really happy marriage, and they actually had 14 children, with 12 reaching adulthood. And Jacquetta was almost perpetually pregnant, continuing to give birth into her 40s. In a lot of ways, you think she can't possibly have had time for witchcraft if she was that busy. But her daughter Elizabeth was born in either 1437 or 1438, and we'll come back to her. But back to Jacquetta. Now, for a while, Jacquetta and Eleanor Cobham were the only royal women left, because Queen Catherine, Henry VI's mother, and then Joan of Navarre had both died by this point, and when Eleanor was accused and stripped of her title, only Jacquetta remained. So as a result, it was only natural that she became part of the party to bring Margaret of Anjou to England to marry Henry VI in 1445. Now, it does seem that the pair got on quite well, and Jacquetta actually became one of Margaret's ladies-in-waiting, and everything seemed fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. So the Earl of Warwick, who had helped put Edward IV on the throne, and again there's reasons for this, but he was quite sore because the Woodvilles then replaced his own family, the Nevilles, as the family closest to Edward. And this was because of the fact that Edward IV had married Elizabeth Woodville, Jacquetta's daughter, in secret. So Edward then started giving all of these really high positions to the Woodvilles, and essentially the Nevilles felt like they'd had their nose pushed out. So the Earl of Warwick decides, well, I made you king. There's reasons. Again, I recommend the book for explanations on why, because we're not going into royal history too much here. But the Earl of Warwick's like, I made you king, I can unmake you king as well. So he captures Edward, and then he executes Richard Woodville in 1469, and he then decides, right, I want to bring the Woodvilles down, so I'm going after Jacquetta, because he can't go after Elizabeth Woodville at this point because she's queen. But Jacquetta, on the other hand, the Queen's mother, he feels he can go after her. And he decides he wants to prove that the Woodvilles would attack England. So, as Jacquetta, he thought didn't have that much support, although he'd proven wrong, but we'll get to that. He then decides to follow the example of the accusations against Eleanor Cobham, and then he has one of his squires say that Jacquetta had used image magic. Now, this was a form of sorcery in which the practitioner would create an image of a person as a means of having an influence over them. So, for example, you might create the person's image out of lead and then snap it in half. Now, this was precisely what Warwick produced as evidence, and it is unclear who the figure was supposed to actually be, and some people thought that Warwick was suggesting that it was him, and that Jacquetta had caused his fall from grace using magic, rather than admitting that a lot of the things that he was getting wrong were judgment calls. So he possibly brought it on himself, but he decided it was Jacquetta's fault. But then he also had a witness claiming that he'd seen images of the king and queen, implying that Jacquetta had used image magic to force Edward to fall in love with Elizabeth. And if people believed this, he could then force an annulment of their marriage, declare all of Edward and Elizabeth's children illegitimate, and just completely rid himself of Elizabeth's family, the Woodvilles. Except people weren't daft, and Jacquetta completely outmanoeuvred him. Now, earlier, she had saved London from being pillaged by Margaret of Anjou's forces when Margaret of Anjou was basically fighting with Edward IV for the throne. And because she'd made sure that London didn't get pillaged, London obviously wanted to support her. So she wrote to London's mayor and aldermen asking for help, reminding them of the help that she'd given them. So they openly threw their support behind her, causing Warwick to back off. Now, it did force Edward to order an investigation, but the whole story fell apart under questioning. So another witness actually shredded Warwick's witness story, saying that the image that was produced as evidence had nothing to do with Jacquetta and it just kind of appeared, and the images of the king and queen didn't actually exist. So Warwick had to release Edward, and then Parliament officially exonerated Jacquetta in 1470. They'd actually always been on her side, because I think they realised that Warwick was just making this up, and they actually recorded the verdict for posterity. So Jacquetta had essentially won this particular battle, but one of the accusations would rear its ugly head again for her daughter. So this is where we get on to Elizabeth, who I've mentioned briefly. Now, she originally married her first husband, Sir John Grey, in 1452, and after he died in 1461, his family tried to block Elizabeth's claim to his land for their children. Now, somehow, although no one is entirely sure how, she ended up meeting King Edward IV, sort of persuaded him to get involved and sort out this issue with the land, but then she married him in secret in 1464. This caused a huge uproar because, like Eleanor Cobham had done, she brought no titles or real wealth to the marriage, and Parliament had really wanted a European bride to form an alliance with another territory. Now, the people actually came to like Elizabeth, and it seems that even Parliament appreciated her cool head, and despite the turbulence of the years surrounding Edward's reign, Elizabeth weathered the storms. She had plenty of children with Edward, including 2 male heirs, Edward and Richard. But it all went wrong after the early death of Edward IV in 1483. Now, his son, Edward V, was only 12 and too young to become king. So Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had himself declared Lord Protector, essentially to run the country as regent until Edward V came of age, which is essentially what Humphrey did before the coronation of Henry VI. except Richard decided he was going to buck the trend and do things his way, so he seized the throne to become Richard III. Elizabeth then fled to Westminster Abbey with her children to claim sanctuary, which had saved her once before, because obviously she was essentially safe from persecution while she was there. Now, Richard did persuade her to part with the boys, ostensibly for Edward's coronation, and took them to the Tower of London, which they never left. And this is what then leads to all the stories about the princes in the tower. Now, Richard suddenly announced people had been plotting against him and finally accused Elizabeth as being the one who was behind it all. And the King's Council, who liked Elizabeth, essentially considered it to be nonsense, especially because Richard was claiming that Elizabeth was working with Jane Shaw, one of Edward IV's mistresses. And you do think, why would Elizabeth be working with one of her husband's mistresses? That just seems a little bit daft. And it also doesn't make sense why Elizabeth would even want to kill Richard, because he was running the country until her son was old enough. There was literally no reason for her to target him at all. Now, of course, this is the story that's passed down to us, but although there isn't really any evidence in the chronicles of the time that he made specific allegations, but it does seem like he threw quite a lot of accusations in the hope that at least one of them would stick. But either way, Richard relied on the idea that Elizabeth had used sorcery to force Edward to marry her, which is a repeat of the accusation used against Eleanor Cobham. Now, he's obviously trying to invalidate Edward V's claim to the throne, because if Edward IV's children were considered illegitimate, then Richard was the only York family left, and he would be the only one with a claim to the throne. Now, interestingly, Richard never provided any evidence, much like the claims against Joan of Navarre, but he simply repeated it was the common opinion in the land, which does feel a little bit like the medieval equivalent of everyone knows and do your research whenever anyone comes out with a completely spurious claim and you go, where did that come from? Oh, Google it. It does kind of feel like Richard was really embodying that kind of energy. And basically he was riffing on the old accusations against Jacquetta, even though she had been exonerated, because mud sticks after all. But Richard didn't really need to make these accusations, because he'd gotten rid of the Woodvilles by either chasing them out of England or executing them as traitors. So by this point, he's quite a powerful and wealthy king, and Elizabeth's this penniless former queen living in Westminster Abbey, so it does seem like a little bit of an unfair fight to start with. Now, he also, crucially, brought no formal charges against Elizabeth, because it seemed that the accusations were enough to sow doubt about Edward V's illegitimacy. And he also came out with a whole range of other ones, like, oh, the marriage was invalid because Edward was actually promised to someone else, and he literally was just grasping at straws at this point. And I think that's one of the reasons why the witchcraft one is the one that sticks with us now, but there was never any evidence produced for it. But as it was, with the possible threat of Henry Tudor, who would go on to become Henry VII, massing an army of Edward's sympathisers, Richard realised he actually needed Elizabeth on his side, because as sort of the reminder of the previous regime, you know, she would really give his court legitimacy. So he persuaded her to come out of sanctuary, and then she and her daughters rejoined the court. And it is believed that her daughter Elizabeth of York was intended to be Richard's wife, because his wife mysteriously died. Their son had died, so that he didn't have a legitimate heir. But Elizabeth was young enough to produce a new one, so some people do actually think that Richard was aiming to marry his niece and then essentially see off any competition over legitimacy through her, and then he would then be able to go, yes, I'm the rightful king, and so on. So Elizabeth did regain some of her old status. She then obviously goes on to become the Dowager Queen and everything, and she absolutely gets her revenge when Richard then falls at the Battle of Bosworth. Now, she did live out the rest of her life in peace and quiet, because she did then affect the marriage between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, who then went on to have Henry VIII. She did get to see her daughter Elizabeth crowned queen, but I think Elizabeth Woodville has long been thought of as perhaps the most famous of England's royal witches. So what do we actually make of these royal witches? And I realise I have just literally fired a whole load of information at you, so I really can't recommend Gemma Holman's book enough if you want to kind of take this at a bit of a slower pace. But I added all the other stuff in there about sorcery and witchcraft in the period, because this is the part that we're interested in. Because witchcraft was an easy thing to accuse, because the burden of proof actually fell on the accused rather than the accuser, which is really weird because most other crimes go the other way around. It was a lot harder to prove you weren't a witch than to prove that someone was one, because even if you were proclaimed innocent, the accusation never entirely disappeared, and such accusation could and did cling to people. Look at Jacquetta and Elizabeth. Now, in the 15th century, women in court were weak in terms of available power, which made it much easier to bring down a man by attacking the women close to him. Love magic was a common accusation because it dovetailed with what was believed to be a woman's greatest preoccupation, finding and keeping a husband. Now, given the sheer number of divinatory practices designed to help women predict who and when they would marry, which were even seen well into the 20th and I would argue 21st century, it's kind of easy to see why it was such a preoccupation. But then there was also the class element. And Eleanor Cobham and Elizabeth Woodville were both daughters of knights who ended up marrying a prince and a king respectively. And given the importance for powerful men to marry women who brought lands, titles or money, their decision to marry for love left these women vulnerable. Because why else, people would ask, would these men marry commoners unless witchcraft was to blame? And I think this class element is the thing that often gets remembered about other witchcraft accusations against cunning folk and so on in later centuries. But this is where we can see that actually sometimes it was literally just because somebody wanted something, and what was the quickest way to bring that person down? Accuse them of being a witch. Now, the royal women were vulnerable precisely because of their position. So they held social and cultural capital, but little else. And even when they were the second wealthiest person in the land, as Joan of Navarre was, a witchcraft accusation could just tear all of that down in an instant. Now, it is interesting that none of the women were executed for their supposed crimes, so it seems that their power did still protect them up to a point. And Joan and Jacquetta, the two highest born, escaped with the least amount of harm. Elizabeth at least saw the downfall of her accuser, but I think poor Eleanor probably had the worst time of it, and it is perhaps most associated with magic in the records. Now, we will never know if any of them actually did use witchcraft, although Philippa Gregory certainly suggests that Jacquetta and Elizabeth did. But I think that Joan and Elizabeth were really famous for being quite religiously pious, so it's unlikely that they would use witchcraft. And I think believing that kings and princes married low-born women due to witchcraft, rather than the women's personal attractions themselves, does actually do the men a disservice, because it completely strips them of the right to make up their own minds about their own lives. But the stories do show the way in which accusations were thrown and withdrawn according to the political climate. So it's quite easy for you to withdraw the accusation when that person then ceases to pose a threat, or indeed you no longer need whatever it is that you made the accusation for. Much like, oh, we don't need Joan's money anymore, so we can say that she's not actually a witch. Or, oh, Jacquetta's actually outmaneuvered me, well then I can remove the accusations because it's clearly false. Now, in some ways, when you look at this, many of the accusations were actually openly disbelieved, which made the accusations handy excuses rather than solid convictions. And it's almost as if the people making them didn't really believe in witchcraft and essentially just wanted to cheat to get their own way. What I want to know is, what do you think of these royal witches? I think they're absolutely fascinating. As I say, that book was really interesting, so I've really enjoyed diving into these four witches, because I knew about Jacquetta and Elizabeth, and I've heard of Deborah Hyde talk about Marjorie Jourdain before, so I sort of knew about Eleanor Cobham, but I had no idea about Joan of Navarre, so it was really interesting to get to have a look into all of them. But please do let me know what you thought of that episode, and I realise this is on the longer side, but I think you can understand why. Now, next month we are going to be changing topic, so we're going to actually be having a look at folklore to do with different types of clothing. And so we'll be looking like footwear, headwear, stuff like that, because there's all kinds of really weird superstitions associated with clothes and really famous bits of folklore. Like if you believe that you're being pixie-led by fairies, turn your clothes inside out and then you'll be able to break the enchantment and stuff. So I really wanted to have a look at specific types of clothing to see what more folklore we can find. So I hope you enjoy that particular month as well. I hope you've enjoyed this month as well, because it's been listener requests and so on, and I am always happy to take requests. So if you do have any other ones, then please do let me know. And speaking of which, the bonus episode for this month is also a listener request, which is actually the legends and folklore associated with Merry King's Close in Edinburgh. So you can become a Patreon at the $3.50 a month or more tier and then get access to that, plus all the other episodes I've done as well. But I'm actually really quite tired after doing that episode, because I've essentially done it in one go. So without any further ado, I'll let you crack on with whatever it is that you want to be doing with the rest of your Saturday. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you next week when we start looking at the folklore of clothes. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, So if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.